Hello and welcome to the Mikobits show. And I'm your host, Mikobits. Today we have an exciting show for you. We have Sam Zou from the SubQuery project. So, SubQuery is a very important developer infrastructure. So, we're going to learn quite a lot about how SubQuery works, and we're going to learn a lot about Web3 development. So, looking forward to this show. Just as a quick disclosure, my fund, Gumi Crypto's Capital, is invested in SubQuery. So, we are a participant, but we definitely are excited about it. And, I guess without further ado, Sam, welcome to the Mikobits show.
Hello, everyone. Thanks, Miko, to invite us. It's a very honor to join the show. Say hello to everyone.
Yeah, wonderful. So the first question is always similar, which is, what is the problem that's solved by SubQuery?
Basically, SubQuery is a universal Web3 data, in index toolkit. The data stored in the blockchain is in a horrible way. It's really hard to retrieve for developers, to retrieve the data they needed in the blockchain. So basically, SubQuery is an indexing protocol, right? That means we can help the developer or any applications easily, retrieve the data they needed in the blockchain. Right? Not just in any particular blockchain, because SubQuery is a universal data indexing solution. We currently working with almost all the layer one protocols.
That's great. I mean, I think one of the things that is so important to contemplate, right, is people talk about blockchain like it's a database. But one of the biggest problems with the blockchain as a database is what's the query? Like, how do you query, right? So, I think this is probably a big issue. So I'm curious about your thoughts.
Exactly, people talk, blockchain is a decentralized, distributed storage. Somehow this is right because that, blockchain definitely is distributed ledger system, right? But however, the way, as I explained to you earlier, like the way how the data stored in the, in the chain or in the blockchain is really in a horrible way to store, not like a traditional database, like a SQL database or whatever. It's a structured, data. So you can easily to query when you write some SQL query, you can easily query the data you needed. But however, the blockchain, right, the distributed ledger is really hard. Sort of like retrieve the data you needed. You take Polkadot or substrate for example. The way how the substrate chain or Polkadot chain, like the data like stored in the chain is just like key value pair. It's unstructured. And it's really hard basically to retrieve all the data you needed, right? So yeah, that's really challenging for the app developers to get the data or get the information they needed in the blockchain. Although some of the blockchain, right, they have a native sort of like SDK. You can through their native SDK to get the data you needed, but it's super complicated. If you want to build a rich like a D app or rich UI, then you need very sort of like complicated data structure. So this is gonna be by using any native SDK gonna be super hard to get the data you needed. So this somehow you need a sort of middleware, right? To sort of middleware like solutions to aggregate the data to simplify the process. So that's where SubQuery jumps in to solve that problem.
So quick question is, what is sort of the primary query language or interface? Like how do if I'm a developer using SubQuery, like how do I address your data set?
Okay, cool. Good question. So if you are a developer, or let's say front-end developer, any app developers, right? So by using SubQuery, right, we provide a sort of like GraphQL APIs. So that means you can, you only need to focus on the business logic, or leave all the back end to SubQuery. Because what happens, the way how SubQuery works, right? basically you define what sort of a data set you needed. Then SubQuery can pre-indexing all the data you needed. Then to save it to the fast performance database. Then at the meantime we're going to producing a sort of a GraphQL interface for the DApp developers, right? So that's make DApp developers life very very easy, right? They can they only need to focus on the top layer like a sort of a business logic. So don't worry about the data layer. So leave SubQuery to handle it.
Quick question is SubQuery only expected to contain on-chain data, or are there any other kinds of data that can be accessed?
At this stage, we only focus on-chain data. It's not, because the SubQuery is not Oracle, right? So it's to any off-chain like data. No, at this stage, we only focus on-chain data.
Got it. Makes sense. And you said that it's pretty much universal, and you're talking about nearly all of the L1s?
Yeah, the way how we design SubQuery is, is really universal, like index. But however, over the last 3 years' time, we're working very, very closely with the Polkadot ecosystem. We grow with the Polkadot together. Until I think a couple months ago, actually, we started expanding our platform or SDK support to other layer ones. Right now, we support Avalanche, we support Cosmos Juno, also Terra. Then we also make it, a few days ago, we make an announcement to support Algorand. So we also have a few other layer ones in our pipeline.
Nice. What about kind of a sort of Ethereum and EVM ecosystem?
I actually already support EVM compatible solution. If you look at the whole Polkadot ecosystem, right? Moonbeam got a EVM compatible, with Ethereum. Also, we have like a sort of like the A star and Akala have EVM plus. Is still few different EVM solutions in the Polkadot ecosystem. We already, like SubQuery, we already support all the EVM solutions in Polkadot. Actually, from theory, we support Ethereum as well. But however, at this stage, it's just not our focus.
Makes sense. Yeah, so that's pretty exciting. One thing I'm very curious about is sort of how about things like caching? Like, is there a need for it? Like, how do you see the process of data caching? Like, obviously there's multiple layers of caching. So I'm curious what your perspectives
Okay.
are.
The caching, I think you are mainly talking about, the implementation layer rather than our toolkit, because our toolkit, just a sort of like indexing the data you needed. If you look at, SubQuery, we have 3-stage development. The first stage is, SubQuery SDK toolkit. The second stage, you need to deploy, your SubQuery SDK to somewhere, either, to our hosted services, or you host it by yourself. Then one of the big challenge is for the development team is they don't want to, a lot of development team, they don't want to waste their time to set up their own environment to do all the maintenance and management by themselves. That's exactly the reason why AWS and GCP, all the clouding providers, really popular, right? To help the development team, to speed up the development plus to do all the maintenance work. Exactly, our second stage development is hosted services. Right now we have more than, I think, a couple hundred SubQuery project deploy into our hosted services. We power hundreds of million requests each day. But then that's the question you asked me about the caching. So the caching basically you need to work in the sort of like in the infrastructure. You're gonna how to caching it, right? For example, right? If your DApp application is very very popular, need to handle like 1 million requests a second, right? How are you gonna handle it? It's not by our SDK. It's sort of like about how we can from our hosted services or from the indexer perspective, how we can speed up the sort of like servicing your DApps. We do our hosted services, right? We run in scalable infrastructure. Scalable infrastructure, that means we do have the cache layer. For high frequent like data you need to request, we have a cache layer. Also, plus we have a robust infrastructure solution. That robust infrastructure solution means if you got a high traffic comes in, we horizontally scale our infrastructure. Now, if you don't need such high, request traffic, we can automatically scale down. So that's from the infrastructure layer, how we handle it.
Amazing. That's great. So shifting a bit of gears, like how did this project begin? Like, what was your how did you come into this, and what were you doing before?
Okay, cool, awesome. Um, yeah, I was in blockchain space since 2016. Before 2016, I was in Web2 like space. I founded a few startups myself for the Web2 project. But when I first touched blockchain, wow, it was amazing. Back to year 2016 and 2017, I got a very, very good opportunity to partner with one of the New Zealand local blockchain development house. Back to 2017, right? There was a this boom time, ICO stage. I helped my old companies carry out a very, very successful ICO because I'm from a technical background, right? Actually I always want to solve some technical challenge, some technical issues. One of the during the time when I was partner in my old company, I sort of like experiencing the pain to manage decentralized blockchain infrastructure. That led me to set up my other business called Onfinality. Onfinality perfectly addressed that issue. That was back to 3 years ago. During that time, actually, we're working closely with the Polkadot ecosystem, the Parity Web3 Foundation and the all Parachain team, right? We're working so closely, with those our customers. From time to time, basically, customer always give us some feedbacks. Oh, can you do this? Can you do this? Back after roughly around 2 years ago, one of the Parachain team talked to us. Oh, Sam, can you provide such a solution for us? Sort of like provide sort of manage like an API solution for them, right? That's make us think. Then we spot opportunities because back to the time in Ethereum, right? Because we all know the graph already in the market, for quite a long time. Then we look at the, look at oh wow, there's gonna be big potential, in other layer ones, for example, Polkadot. So they make us, kick off the development, back to I think roughly 18 months ago, to also we got a very, very good support, from Parity and Web3 Foundation, also from from a lot of like a Parachain team as well. That's the reason we kick off this project. It's really from my perspective, right? I'm a sort of like from Web2 space. It's really like I'm the customer driven guy or the requirement driven guy. Means whenever I got a requirement, I can see the requirement, the customer first. Then I saw it's gonna have big customer base, big potential. That's the reason we kick off this project, right? Yeah.
Nice. So you're based in New Zealand, is that correct?
Yeah. I'm based in New Zealand, but the business is really global business, right? Because majority of our customer is based in Europe and America. Majority of our team right at this stage based in Auckland, New Zealand, but we is sort of like a distributed team. We do have a team member based in Singapore. We also have a very small office in Singapore as well. Also, we have a few people based in Portugal, Lisbon. It's a really global team, global business.
Amazing. Very good. Yeah. So I guess one of the things so you mentioned in 2016, you kind of became a blockchainer, and of course later on worked very closely with the Polkadot. But like, what was the first moment of blockchain for you? Like, how did that happen?
Oh, the first moment, because I've heard Bitcoin or back to years, yes, because although I'm in the Web2 space, right? Because I'm working with developers every day, right? Back to year 2013 or 14, even 12, I know a few of my colleagues actually did Bitcoin mining. Back to that time, I didn't pay that much attention. I just know, oh, probably whatever, Then after in 2016 or 17, right? This is the ICO boom stage. The boom stage means wow, the project can easily sort of like raising fund, not just raising fund, have a, you release your white paper, to have a vision, right? Then you can, sort of like a build a team to sort of like implement your vision. That's super cool, right? So then back to the time, sort of year 2017, as I said, right? When we really working on the sort of ICO time, when you did the ICO, raise the fund, convert the fund to the real dollars in the bank. Wow, that's real. You know what I mean? So this is the world gonna be changed. The world gonna be changed means back to the days when you transfer any money, global, transfer USD or whatever the currency, it can take days, a big transaction phase, right, from the bank. But however, when you transfer these days, right, when you transfer any like a payment, if by stable coin or whatever, just a second or 2 seconds, so no delay at all. So it's so reliable, so this definitely gonna change, right? It changed the whole industry, right? Oh, change the whole financial space. So this totally like shocked me back to year 2000, I would say 17, right? So yeah, that make me think. All right, because we have, we are in the, if you look at, in the Web 2, when the first internet comes up, it's back to roughly around, like 30 years ago. The people of, people, it's quite hard to change the people's mind back to the time. Probably people think, this is the internet bubble or whatever. But if you look at 2016 or 17, people probably still think, blockchain is just bubble. But however, in the last couple of years' time, you see a lot of real use case, Web3 use case comes up, like, DeFi, NFT or GameFi. It's, real use case comes up, right? Plus, I do believe there is some really, really good enterprise solution as well, like enterprise, like a use case in the blockchain space as well. So this, I firmly believe it definitely, have a big potential. Not blockchain just solve the cryptocurrency, in the financial space, but also some more and more like enterprise use case gonna become up. That's my view.
I'm curious about some of the application development. One of the areas that I'm curious about is sort of the NFT area, right? So, NFT, comprises significant amount of sort of on-chain data. So I'm curious, like, how you see this, and what kind of applications, what kind of application developers and development you're seeing in the NFT area? What do you think the future of it is?
Okay, so we are basically on the data layer. We provide the infrastructure, right? So that means we got a very good opportunities to working with all the top layer, sort of like DApp teams, like NFT or DeFi or GameFi or whatever. There are quite a few like NFT protocols we are working so very closely because they're using our solution, right? So yeah, I do see it's definitely a sort of a the one of the very cool area, because NFT basically non-fungible token is not a new concept. Actually, the NFT that concept comes up at least like a couple of years, like 2000. I believe, if I got a good memory, probably 2018. This is the ERC 731 or whatever, one of the standard, right? So in my view is, these days you see a lot of projects currently come to the NFT space, the NFT space. But I do see, there's a lot of very good like NFT protocols, working closely with us. But however, in my view is just a sort of a, let's say, 2 years ago, the DeFi suddenly, comes, getting hot. Then NFT, especially last year, is getting very hot. But these days, right, not too many new NFT projects comes up because the market already could, cool down, a sort of like a cool down, right? Maybe because everyone knows right now is crypto winter. Crypto winter is comes in. But I do believe it's a good good time for the builder, to build. I think if you look at, DeFi or a few other cool like blockchain projects, is all, like developing during the winter time. I would say crypto winter time,
Yeah.
right? So I do believe, in this crypto winter time, definitely gonna have more and more like crazy ideas gonna come up, gonna innovate the whole industry. But it's crypto winter is good for the project like us, and also creative like a entrepreneurs, comes up with new ideas, right? But from a SubQuery perspective, as I said, we working on the data or middleware layer, regardless which like a sort of like a protocols, right? DeFi, NFT or GameFi or whatever, they are kind of all using our solution, right?
Yeah. So you don't have to speculate. So
Yeah, we don't have to speculate. You're
one
right.
thing I'm curious about is that, like, with indexing, you very much identified like a missing core function within kind of the Web3 developer stack, right? So I guess one of the things I'm curious about is, do you see other missing functions? Like, what are the pieces that remain to be built? What are the infrastructure and middleware pieces that you think are going to be needed, right, as we go forward and develop a really robust developer model?
Okay, I think in my view is, of course, I think that what we build is definitely developer needed, right? Because we provide really robust solution to provide the data, the data set to make a developer life easier. Plus, we not only provide the toolkit, but also we building sort of like a decentralized SubQuery network. So that means we're gonna have more and more like a good service provider, participate our network, provide reliable sort of hosted infrastructure, decentralized hosted infrastructure for the DApp developers. It's definitely gonna help. But however, what I do see is a sort of like a lot of the DApp not only using on-chain data, right? Some of the app they also need some off-chain data. So this is somewhere probably combine SubQuery with some Oracle solution. I think that make a lot of sense. You know what I mean? In that space, but probably this is something from SubQuery perspective we can see if we can expanding our toolkit to support such. I think that's gonna be really cool to solve the app developer pains.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. In terms of any kind of biggest type of applications, like, what are the biggest users of, you don't have to name names, but I'm curious, like, what types of applications are the heavy users?
If because if you look like a SubQuery currently powers almost all the different verticals like a DeFi, NFT, and the wallets, Explorer, and GameFi. But what we do see right now, from our platform or from our data, we can see wallet at this stage is generating more traffics, right? Wallet and the scanner, Explorer is generating more traffic, but especially at this stage, it's sort of like a crypto winter, right? User not using that much, not that much traffic. So and wallet definitely, and Explorer definitely. There's two verticals generating more traffic at this stage. But however, as I said, right, it really depends on different period. Like if suddenly one of the NFT protocols is getting hot or popular, it's highly likely going to generate more traffic, right?
Nice. So, one thing that I always kind of like to ask is sort of like, what is the sort of big long-term vision, and what's the sort of big idea that comes out of something like this, right? So, you know, I think you were describing sort of essentially the Web3 future. Like, do you have a special take on what that looks like? Or, obviously, having a data-driven future, combining on and off chain data, but like, how do you see kind of the future of Web3?
The future of Web3, of course, probably different, like people have different view or different definition with the Web3, right? So it's a lot of people have different ideas with Web3. But from my view is Web3, it's definitely is next generation of the internet. It's from, of course, it's we need to build more decentralized. If you look Web2, it's sort of like a server clients and server. Then the Web3, the architecture definitely be, decentralized because it makes more sense. Then, of course, need to have a proper, sort of a economic, like a make it more economic sense. Like, what do we build? Like all Web3 protocols, almost all the Web3 protocols have a token economy. How we can sort of like get more like a normal user participate in your like Web3 ecosystem. That means whoever participate the ecosystem can always get some sort of like benefits from the ecosystem. But right now, if you for the Web2 project, right, like all the big giant like Facebook or whatever, whenever using it, you don't enjoy any gain, right? That's sort of like a there's definitely no Web3. So Web3, definitely has to be whoever participate, in the ecosystem supposed to have some incentive or get some sort of like a gains. Also, the data privacy and those kind of need to be protected. That definitely, in my view, of Web3. So I do have 100%, it's the big future of Web3. Probably, we are in this space, right? We can see the potential.
So when you think about kind of off-chain data, like, can you imagine kind of how you store such a thing?
Um, w- one of the solution we can do is that's the reason, right? Like a lot of like right now in past, I would say past year or two, a lot of new protocol came up. So for the off-chain data, we can always bring those important chain data into the chain. So that means it's make the data more transparent, the more trustworthy or trustable, right? So of course, some of the data, off chain probably is quite hard, to fit into the blockchain. But from my view is, um, definitely some middleware solutions can, solve this sort of problems, like move as much as off-chain data to on-chain. That means make more transparent, build more like sort of like a immutable, to the immutable data, or more transparent, to the DX, right?
I think one of the thoughts that I have is that, like, when you think about sort of the Filecoin kind of Arweave ceramic kind of that whole thing, and with access control things like lit protocol, like if you look at this whole stack over in the kind of decentralized storage area, the thing that's kind of interesting is a lot of the focus on storage is on kind of unstructured data, kind of blobs, like JPEG kind of vibes, right? So to me, the thing that is possible is, what do you think about, since you're having kind of an index, you're presenting kind of GraphQL, like what about the idea of sort of a decentralized structured data storage, right, as a service?
Oh, a very, very interesting question. Also, I think I thought about it ages ago,
Sure.
but this definitely have a technical challenge. It's not that easy to implement it, right? Otherwise, this is gonna be becoming big and big, in terms of your node. I think it's a very, very interesting question, right? So I do here, some of the protocols, right? I don't want to name it. It's trying to build decentralized, like a structured database. But I think at this stage, still is not that easy. There's some technical challenge there, to
But
make it happen.
what about
But
a different model? So you seem to be talking about kind of a decentralized structured data, right? But what about sort of a really service oriented data storage, right? So for example, if you have an application and the application wants to store structured metadata, right? And the metadata that's structured can be attached to indices and through like a primary key like user, right? So you have a user or a wallet, and the application can sort of store, right? So this particular use case may not be decentralized or may not require decentralized storage, right? May really just be thinking about it just from an application storage perspective, right? So I'm curious if you see any such use cases or any thoughts about this type of thing.
All right, I'm with you now. I do believe, as I said, right, the way how I, drive our developments is really requirement driven and
Yeah.
customer driven. So that means I didn't see like a full use case, for fully decentralized structured
Yeah.
data storage at this stage. I didn't see, even if you implement it, tell me the real use case, what problem
Yeah.
you're trying to resolve. But however, I do believe, in the future, definitely I might have some use case, to for such. But before we make a fully decentralized structured database, I do see I might have different use case. We like the use case you just mentioned. Probably we only need to save the metadata or
Yes.
whatever the app requirement on chain. Then for the real data, still save off chain somewhere. But however, the metadata is there, right? So it's a step to step until fully sort of like a decentralized, the structured database, So, but I do believe, as you said, your use case is sort of like a valid use case. I do see it definitely, somewhere probably we can think about it as well. So, but as I said, whatever we do has to be make sense, has to be need to have a requirement, need to have a customer, willing to use it. Otherwise, we won't build
Sure.
it. It's very, very important, right? So yeah.
Sure. So you talked about kind of how you got started in the Polkadot and Substrate ecosystems. Like, I think it might be helpful for my audience to kind of get the update from you with respect to the whole Polkadot, ecosystem, right? So obviously, there's been several parachain auctions successful. Obviously, a star, things like Moonbeam, Akala, SubQuery. So I'm curious, like, what if you have any kind of news from the Polkadot world, especially for viewers that may not be that familiar with Polkadot. So I'd love to kind of get your kind of view of where we are.
Okay, cool, awesome, good question. Yeah, as I said, yeah, almost we grow, with the Polkadot together in past 3 years time. We working very, very closely with the Polkadot team, right? Or it's not only like parity, but also those parachain team you mentioned, like Moonbeam, Akala, or A-Star, and a few others parallel for us. And almost all the our solution is not only limited in the in the parachain. Our solution is really a sort of like a native for Substrate. Substrate, for those of you who don't know Substrate is sort of like a framework, to make a blockchain developer life easier to develop, layer 1 or layer 0 protocols or whatever the protocols you development. So it's like in the Web 2 space. If you want to develop a software, right, you don't want to develop from scratch. If you have a framework, you can probably already have the building block. They can make your life so easier. So basically, Substrate is such framework. So that framework, basically, you don't have to building everything from scratch, because Substrate, you already have such a framework, right? So you just need to focus on your sort of a blockchain logic. So you don't have to, build that framework. That's really, really powerful. That's exactly the reason, back to 3 years ago, we think definitely, the Gav Wood, this guy gonna change the whole blockchain space. The way how, in terms of the way how developing the blockchain protocol, right? That's, we love it. We love it. We saw the big potential with the Substrate. So that's the reason we're working so closely, and even at a very earlier stage, we actually contribute quite a lot to the Substrate framework as well. A lot of our team members, existing team members, they are big contributor to the Substrate open source. So yeah, for those of you who don't know, like Polkadot or Substrate, Polkadot apparently, has been long time in the market now, right? So it's we see the big boom for Polkadot since last November, since the first parachain auction. The parachain auction, this is really crazy or new ideas. It's almost changed the whole space. If you look, Polkadot is sort of like a relay chain. The relay chain provide all the securities for all the different parachain. So the parachain, each parachain basically has its own sort of like a focus. Like some of the parachain probably focus on DeFi, some of the parachain focus on identity. So it's the idea is to build a whole ecosystem. That ecosystem basically allow anyone want to jump in the ecosystem. They can using existing model. For example, if you are from Web2 development background, if you want to build a e-commerce, for example, probably you need a identity solution. Then you don't want to build from scratch, right? So probably you can using existing framework. So the same concept, for the Web3 or Polkadot ecosystem, right? Probably some of the parachains specialize, on the identity. So basically, whenever you're building your own Web3 solution, so you don't have to building that sort of identity solution. You can using the parachain straight directly, so save all your development costs, right? So that's the idea behind it. Of course, the parity guys, is to keep improving the whole process, keep improving the whole ecosystem, right? So as I said, we do see a lot of other layer 1 and the layer 2 protocols trying to do some similar concept. It'll give you an example like Avalanche, right? They have the concept like subnet. Subnet is very similar to parachain as well. But also, if you look at Polygon, Polygon is trying to launch their supernet. It's very similar to parachain concept as well. So, it's funny industry.
Yeah, I'm curious what your thoughts are in terms of programming model. I know that Gavin Wood, and I know that Polkadot, especially things like a Star and Moonbeam have been supportive of the WebAssembly or WASM or EWASM model. So, I'm wondering do you have any thoughts about kind of WASM or any kind of thoughts about sort of the advancement of this kind of programmability model?
WASM, I think this is very lightweight, solutions, right? To be honest, I'm at this stage, I'm not working that closely, with the development team. I know WASM definitely there's it's a lightweight solution. There's need a very a sort of because it's using Rust. It's very hard language. So it's not not a lot of programmers know how to programming Rust. So it's pretty hard, pretty hard language to learn. So I think as I said, WASM, right, is a lightweight solution. I do believe there's somewhere by the way, SubQuery we already support the WASM WASM solution. This is pretty good. I don't have, to be honest, transparent. I don't have that big sort of view on the future how it goes, because that's not something we are focused on.
Okay, well, just trying to get a little news from the Polkadot world. So I guess one of the things I'm curious about is sort of roadmap, right? So in terms of what's next for SubQuery, what are the next big features or milestones?
Okay, cool. As I said earlier, SubQuery, we have a 3-stage development. The first stage, is an open source toolkit. So open source toolkit, from the name is open source. Basically, everyone can get it. So everyone can get it, to develop the SubQuery project and host and manage by themselves. But as I said, one of the challenges for the blockchain team is they don't want to waste time, right? So this comes to our second stage is hosted services. Hosted services, as I said, we already have hundreds of a project deployed into our hosted services. We powers sort of servicing hundreds of million requests a day. Then The third stage is SubQuery Network. SubQuery Network is a decentralized SubQuery network, right? To trying to incentivize more service providers to participate to SubQuery Network to enjoy to sort of the gains or the benefits from the SubQuery network. So right now we are in the third stage, the SubQuery network. We basically, in last couple of months time, we launched 3 seasons of SubQuery testnet. The first season, because the main player for SubQuery network is indexers, delegators, and consumers, right? Who I think the indexers play very, very major role. So indexers, that's what I call it, a service provider, right? So in our first season testnet, we have more because it's invite only. Before we launch our testnet, we send a sort of impression of interest, what do you call it, interest to our community. We receive almost 3,000 applicants who want to run the indexer, right? It's amazing. Then what we did is we only invite, sort of I won't say good because all the investors good. We only look, this reputable or investors to invite in our season 1 and season 2. For our season 1 testnet, we have roughly around 50 indexers. Because it's invite only, we only invite very limited indexers to participate, right? To play or work with us together. Because as I said, requirement driven, customer driven. We need more feedbacks, not just because we are development team. We don't think we can't just think, oh, that's right. We need to get real customer to using it, then give us feedback. That's exactly the way how you develop the software, right? So we get a very, very good feedbacks from our community, from the indexers, right? Then we keep improving it. Then we launch our season 2, season 2 testnet. Season 2 testnet is still invite only. Then we have roughly around 150 indexers participate in season 2. Then season 2 a testnet, we allow more people from our community to claim sort of a testing token to do the delegations, to play with play with the reward. This is a very, very good experience for the participants. Then we launched our season 3 a testnet a couple weeks ago, roughly around 3 weeks ago. So season 3 is still a testnet. Actually, is open to public. That means anyone whoever interested in SubQuery can participate in season 3. So for season 3 testnet, we have more than 1,250 indexers participate in our testnet. That number keeps going up. As I said, SubQuery is sort of a multi-chain solution. It's not limited to Polkadot, right? For season 3 testnet, the indexers not only can indexing or running Polkadot solution, but also can run Avalanche and Cosmos or Juno, right? So it's amazing. We have roughly around 500 indexers indexing Juno or indexing Cosmos. That's give us more and more confidence. We definitely once we support other layer ones, we're gonna have more and more the whole blockchain community backing us, not just from Polkadot. Of course, Polkadot is still our home regardless, because that's where we grow up, right? It's very, very important. Then, for this, as I said, the season 3 testnet is still going. So for whoever interested to participate in the season 3 testnet, feel free, to go to our website. You will find, or join our Discord. You will find more information about how to claim a sort of a testing token, how to participate as an indexer or as a delegator. There's very, very interesting. We generate a lot of traffic in our season 3 testnet. So, but also we do it, from development perspective, right? It's very, very important to do the load testing. Load testing means, what's the maximum capacity, our testnet. When we launch, especially when we launch the mainnet, we need to make sure our network can handle such load, right? So we did a lot of load testing to make sure we can maximum handle whatever the load we can handle. That's very, very important. As I said, season 3 is still going.
Quick closing questions is really like, what are the best places to follow? Like you mentioned your social media, you mentioned your website, but maybe you can help. Where are these
Yeah.
things, and how can people connect?
Oh, I think the best place to follow is really our Discord. Our Discord currently have more than
But if
70,000
but
active
the user
members in
needs
our
to know
Discord.
the URL. Maybe the main website, you can go to the Discord from there. So
Okay, so go to our website. Our website is SubQuery.network. You can find all the information in our website. You will see our social media link. Also, you will see our Discord link. You can get all the information from our
fantastic.
official website.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, well, this has been terrific. Really excited to see these upcoming milestones, and thank you so much for joining the Mikobits show.
Oh, thanks, Miko. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me here. Also, thanks for backing
We're very
SubQuery
excited to
project.
see all these new developments. Thank you very much.